The capture, November 15th, 1899. The armoured train lurched to a grinding halt 3 miles north of Frere, Natal Colony, its twisted metal screaming against crushed rails. Winston Churchill, war correspondent for the Morning Post, tasted copper blood as his head slammed against steel plating. Boer artillery had ripped through the engine with surgical precision, derailing 3 cars and trapping 70 British soldiers in a killing zone. The 24-year-old journalist stumbled from the wreckage into a nightmare of smoke and screaming metal. Rifle fire cracked from the surrounding kopjes. This was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission along the railway line between Estcourt and Colenso. Instead, it became Churchill's introduction to captivity. He moved without thinking, organizing soldiers to clear the debris blocking the track while bullets sang past his head. For 90 minutes he worked in the open, directing men to lever twisted metal aside, shouting commands over the thunder of Boer Mausers. The engine driver sat paralyzed with fear. Churchill grabbed the man's shoulder and forced him to reverse the locomotive, inching it backward through the wreckage. They freed the engine. Wounded soldiers were loaded aboard. The train began to move. Churchill ran alongside, then stopped. He had no weapon. He wore civilian clothes. The distinction between combatant and correspondent blurred in the smoke and chaos, but international law was clear. He was a non-combatant observer. He raised his hands. 3 Boer horsemen emerged from the acrid haze, their Mausers levelled at his chest. Their leader, a field cornet named Sarel Oosthuizen, gestured with his rifle barrel. Churchill's hands stayed raised. The Boers were farmers turned soldiers, many wearing mismatched clothing and carrying supplies looted from British positions. Oosthuizen spoke Afrikaans, then switched to accented English. "You fought, you organized, you are prisoner." Churchill protested his status as correspondent, showed his press credentials, and pointed to the Red Cross armband, officially designating him a non-combatant. Oosthuizen spat tobacco juice and ignored him. International conventions meant nothing on this veldt. The Boers had watched him direct soldiers under fire for 90 minutes. That made him a combatant. The march to the Boer lines began immediately. Churchill walked with 68 other prisoners, mostly Dublin Fusiliers and Durban light infantry captured from the train. His shoulder throbbed where he had struck the carriage wall. The November sun baked the Natal veldt. No water was offered. Boer commandos rode alongside the column, their contempt visible in every glance. These were not professional soldiers bound by Geneva protocols. They were burghers defending their republics against British imperialism, and they treated prisoners as invaders, deserving no mercy beyond being kept alive for exchange. 3 days later, Churchill stood before General Pierre Joubert at the Boer headquarters in Pretoria. The interrogation was brief. Joubert examined the press credentials, then set them aside. "You directed troops under fire. You cleared the track. You are an officer in all but name." Churchill's protests were noted and dismissed. His fate was sealed not by law, but by observation. Boer intelligence officers had interviewed the commandos who captured him. Their testimony was unanimous. This journalist had acted as a combat leader. He would be imprisoned with military captives, not released as a non-combatant. The decision was final. The journey to the state model schools in Pretoria took 2 more days by rail. Churchill watched the Transvaal landscape roll past through barred windows, calculating distances and escape routes even then. The other prisoners sat in silence, many wounded, all exhausted. A captain from the Dublin Fusiliers named Aylmer Haldane had also been captured from the armoured train. Haldane studied Churchill with sharp intelligence, recognizing something beyond typical correspondent passivity. They said little during transport, but awareness passed between them. Both men understood that capture was temporary unless they accepted it as permanent. The state model schools stood in central Pretoria, a 2-story brick building converted into a prisoner of war facility for British officers. No barbed wire surrounded it initially. The Boers relied on guards, high walls, and the surrounding veldt to contain prisoners. Churchill arrived on November 18th, processed through a courtyard where Boer soldiers stripped prisoners of anything useful. Money, watches, pocket knives, even buttons disappeared into guard pockets. The processing officer, a Hollander named Opperman, spoke crisp English and made clear the rules. Escape attempts would be met with execution. Cooperation meant eventual exchange. The war would end soon. Patience would be rewarded. Churchill said nothing, but his eyes mapped every wall, every guard post, every routine. The prison held 60 officers in cramped classrooms converted to barracks. Beds were straw mattresses on wooden frames. Food arrived twice daily, coarse mealy porridge and occasional stringy beef. The Boers provided enough to prevent starvation, but nothing more. Sanitation consisted of buckets emptied each morning. The stench became invisible after 3 days, a constant background horror the mind learned to ignore. After the initial shock of capture wore off, a deep, soul-crushing boredom set in. Days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of porridge, latrine duty, and futile staring at the walls. To fight the lethargy, some men organized lectures on history or military strategy. Others formed card tournaments, wagering with pebbles. These small rituals were a fragile dam against the encroaching despair. Roll call occurred at dawn and dusk. Prisoners lined in the courtyard while Boer guards counted heads with mechanical precision. Miss a count, and the entire prison faced reduced rations. The collective punishment was calculated to turn prisoners against potential escapers. The Boers guarded the state model schools with 30 Zarps, police soldiers of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek. These were not the farmer commandos who had captured Churchill. Zarps were uniformed, disciplined, and watched prisoners with the cold efficiency of men who knew their job was to prevent escape, not provide comfort. They patrolled the perimeter in 2-hour shifts, rifles loaded, orders clear, shoot anyone attempting to scale the walls. The 10-foot barrier surrounding the prison was brick, topped with iron railings, illuminated by electric lights after dark. The Boers had installed modern security rare in South Africa, recognizing that British officers would test every weakness. Churchill spent his first week observing patterns. Guards changed shifts at noon and midnight. The southeastern corner of the wall fell into shadow between the electric lights, a gap of perhaps 15 feet. The latrine stood adjacent to that corner, its low roof offering potential access to the wall top. But timing was everything. Guards patrolled in pairs, overlapping their routes to prevent blind spots. 2 minutes, perhaps 3, represented the maximum window when that corner went unwatched. Not enough time to climb, not enough time to drop safely on the far side. Not enough time unless everything aligned perfectly. Captain Haldane approached Churchill on the 8th day of captivity. Another officer, a Lieutenant Brocky, stood with him. Both had been watching Churchill's observations with knowing expressions. Haldane spoke quietly in the corner of their shared barracks room. "You're planning something. We see it. Include us or abandon it." Churchill measured them. Haldane was regular army, career soldier, skilled at reading terrain and calculating odds. Brocky was younger but equally sharp. 3 men had better chances than 1, but 3 men also meant 3 opportunities for betrayal, accident, or panic. Churchill made his decision. They would plan together, execute together, succeed or die together. The prison routine revealed weaknesses slowly. Food arrived from outside caterers, delivered by civilian Africans who spoke no English but whose movements were unsupervised inside the walls. Laundry went out weekly to Pretoria washerwomen. Letters passed through censors, but the process was slow, offering opportunities to hide messages in seemingly innocent text. Most critically, the Boers permitted prisoners to purchase supplies from a local merchant, goods delivered into the compound without thorough searches. The Transvaal government wanted to appear civilized, treating officer prisoners according to conventions, even while denying those same prisoners their legal rights as non-combatants. Churchill tested the guards with small provocations. He walked too close to the walls during exercise periods. He lingered near the gate during deliveries. He asked questions about Pretoria's layout, feigning casual interest in the city's geography. The guards responded predictably. They warned him back from restricted areas. They answered geographic questions with pride in their capital. They never suspected intelligence gathering because Churchill seemed too obvious, too privileged, too British to attempt anything serious. The correspondent persona was his greatest asset. Journalists ask questions. Journalists observe. Journalists wander. Nobody expects them to climb walls. By December, Churchill, Haldane, and Brocky had refined their plan. The southeastern corner remained the optimal exit point. They would go at night during the guard change at midnight when confusion was highest. One man would boost the others onto the latrine roof. From there, a quick scramble to the wall top. Then a 12-foot drop into the garden of the house adjoining the prison. Beyond that house lay Pretoria's streets, then the Portuguese territory of Mozambique, 300 miles to the east. The plan was suicide. They refined it anyway. The Boer authorities grew suspicious of Churchill specifically by mid-December. His status as correspondent turned combatant made him valuable for propaganda, but dangerous as a prisoner. General Joubert considered transferring him to a more secure facility. Word of this reached Churchill through a sympathetic guard who spoke broken English and hated the Hollander officers commanding the Zarps. The transfer could come any day. The window was closing. December the 12th, 1899 became the date. Midnight. The southeastern corner. 3 men. Everything depended on 2 minutes of shadow. Churchill stood in the courtyard on the evening of December 11th, watching the electric lights flicker on as dusk fell. The Boers had installed them to prevent exactly what he planned, but electricity in Pretoria was unreliable, the power station primitive, the lines prone to fluctuation. The lights would dim for seconds at irregular intervals, not long enough to plan around, but long enough to exploit if fortune aligned. He looked at Haldane. The captain nodded once. Brocky stood ready. Tomorrow night, the walls would speak, either in triumph or gunfire. Churchill felt no fear, only the mathematical certainty that staying meant transfer to a place where escape became impossible. The state model schools was his only chance. Midnight tomorrow, he would take it. The Boer guards patrolled beneath the lights, confident in their electric security, never imagining a British correspondent would gamble everything on 2 minutes of darkness and the arrogance to climb a wall in plain sight. Chapter 2. The State Model School in Pretoria was never designed to hold prisoners of war. The 2-story red brick building had served as a respectable educational institution before the conflict transformed it into a cage for captured British officers. Churchill arrived after a grueling 3-day train journey north, his body aching from seemingly endless hours of standing in packed, foul-smelling cattle cars. The Boer guards marched him through heavy iron gates into a dusty courtyard where dozens of officers already milled about in various states of dejection and boredom. The transition from the vast, open veldt to the stark reality of confinement struck him like a physical blow, a sudden constriction of the world and the spirit. The walls rose a sheer 12 feet high, topped with corrugated iron sheeting that glinted cruelly in the African sun. Sentries, impassive and alert, paced along the perimeter at intervals, measured with a grim precision calculated to eliminate any and all blind spots. This was captivity, reduced to its most basic, unforgiving mathematical essentials. The first roll call came with the pale light of dawn. Churchill stood in formation with 67 other officers, silently learning the new ritual that would rigidly structure every day of his imprisonment. The Boer guards counted them methodically, their rifles held across their chests, their eyes scanning for any deviation from prescribed positions. A captain standing 2 rows ahead of Churchill shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. A guard sergeant's sjambok, a vicious whip of rhinoceros hide, cracked across the captain's shoulders without warning or explanation, a sharp, ugly sound in the morning stillness. The captain immediately straightened, his face a mask. No one spoke. No one so much as glanced at the man who had been struck. Churchill understood immediately and completely that any attention meant selection, and selection invariably meant punishment. To become invisible was to survive. The count finished. The guards dismissed them with curt Afrikaans commands that Churchill didn't understand, but quickly learned to obey through keen observation and raw instinct. The daily routine emerged through a process of brutal, soul-crushing repetition. After roll call, the prisoners received their morning ration, a grey, lumpy mealy porridge that tasted of mildew and contained mysterious dark grains Churchill suspected, with a grim certainty, were rodent droppings. He ate it anyway. Hunger made aesthetics irrelevant within 48 hours. The school's former classrooms had been converted to dormitories, with 30 men packed into spaces originally meant for 15 students. The air was thick with the scent of unwashed humanity. Churchill claimed a corner position on the hard wooden floor, knowing from his single night aboard the cattle car that wall space meant marginally better, less disturbed sleep. The man beside him, a stoic lieutenant named Haldane from the Dublin Fusiliers, had been captured during the same armoured train engagement. They never discussed the battle. To speak of freedom, of action, of the life that had been so violently snatched away, felt obscene within these suffocating walls. Work details began promptly at 8. The Boers assigned tasks with a calculated efficiency, transforming proud British officers into common labourers who served their captors' practical needs. Churchill found himself hauling heavy sacks of coal from delivery wagons to the building cellar, a physically demanding and degrading task designed specifically to humiliate men accustomed to commanding others. Each shovelful felt like a fresh indignity. The fine coal dust coated his lungs, causing a persistent hacking cough, and stained his hands and face a permanent shade of black. By the end of the first week, his soft palms had developed thick, painful calluses that wept clear fluid when he inadvertently squeezed them. The physical labour exhausted him completely, a state which he recognized as entirely intentional. Tired prisoners lacked the mental and physical energy for resistance or planning an escape. The guards rotated on methodical 4-hour shifts. Churchill began tracking their movements almost unconsciously, a habit born from years of journalistic observation rather than any conscious planning. The morning guards were older men, grizzled veterans of earlier Boer campaigns, methodical and utterly professional in their duties. They walked their prescribed routes along the wall perimeter with unwavering consistency, pausing at each corner to survey the courtyard before continuing. The afternoon shift brought younger, less disciplined sentries who smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and would occasionally turn their backs to the yard to converse with each other during the hottest hours, their laughter a grating sound of liberty. Churchill noticed these patterns without yet understanding their full significance. His mind simply catalogued the details, because that is what his mind did. 3 weeks bled into 6. The November heat intensified, transforming the brick building into a furnace that trapped the suffocating stench of unwashed bodies and overflowing latrine buckets. Disease spread as an inevitability. Dysentery struck first, a vicious, debilitating scourge that turned the primitive toilet facilities into sites of desperate public misery. Churchill watched 2 men die within a single week, their emaciated bodies carried out unceremoniously at dawn before roll call to avoid disrupting the all-important count. The guards showed no discernible reaction to the deaths. The living prisoners showed even less. Grief required emotional resources that malnutrition and perpetual exhaustion had systematically depleted. Churchill soon stopped counting the days because the counting itself felt like a form of surrender to the idea of permanence. The delicate prisoner dynamics revealed themselves through forced proximity and shared necessity. Haldane, Churchill discovered, possessed a practical engineering knowledge, understanding matters of structural load-bearing and architectural weaknesses that Churchill's liberal arts education had never addressed. Another officer, a quiet, watchful South African-born Brit named Brockie, spoke Afrikaans fluently and would translate precious fragments of guard conversations that drifted through the courtyard. He reported, in a low whisper, that the Boers considered Churchill particularly valuable due to his famous family connections to the Duke of Marlborough. They were actively debating transferring him to a more secure, high-risk facility in Waterville, some 60 miles to the north. Brockie delivered this information without emotion, a simple conduit for dangerous facts, but Churchill felt its chilling weight. Transfer meant permanent, hopeless imprisonment. This building, whatever its horrors, now represented his only chance. The guards maintained a strict hierarchy that the prisoners learned to navigate through careful, constant observation. The commandant, a severe man named Opperman, commanded the facility. Appearing only for inspections, he conducted with Germanic precision every third day. His arrival always triggered frantic cleaning by the prisoners, who had learned that any disorder resulted in reduced rations. Beneath Opperman, a sergeant named De Souza ran the daily operations with a casual, almost bored cruelty. He carried his sjambok everywhere and used it frequently, not in flashes of anger, but with the methodical consistency of a man training dogs. Churchill witnessed De Souza strike a prisoner who had stumbled during coal hauling, then turn away immediately to casually discuss rainfall patterns with another guard. The violence was purely administrative, a tool for maintaining order, disconnected from emotion or malice. This, Churchill found, made it far more frightening than rage would have been. The coping mechanisms emerged organically among the desperate prisoners. Some men established rigid exercise routines, pacing prescribed routes around the courtyard perimeter day after day to maintain some semblance of physical conditioning. Others formed discussion groups that debated obscure points of military tactics or recounted glorious campaigns from Britain's vast imperial history. Churchill participated occasionally, but found the conversations circular and deeply depressing. They revealed men trapped in the wreckage of the past because the present offered nothing but degradation and the future existed only as a hazy, theoretical abstraction. He much preferred the company of the younger officers who still possessed enough fire and energy to complain, their anger a welcome proof that they hadn't fully succumbed to the creeping institutional numbness. By the second month, Churchill's body had adapted to the reduced rations in the brutal way of all starving creatures. He had lost perhaps 20 pounds, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had always carried a slight excess. The hunger never disappeared, but it became a familiar dull ache, simply a part of existence rather than an acute, ever-present crisis. His mind, paradoxically, sharpened, as if freed from the body's more superficial demands. With his physical desires reduced to their raw essentials, his mental acuity increased. He began reading voraciously from the small library the Boers permitted, losing himself in the grand narratives of Gibbon and Macaulay that transported him temporarily beyond the walls. But the reading also amplified his awareness of confinement. Each time he closed a book, the walls seemed closer, the courtyard smaller, and the future infinitely more constricted. The latrine facilities bordered the eastern wall, positioned inconveniently near the building's rear corner where two walls met at a right angle. Churchill took to using them during the evening period when foot traffic decreased and the guards changed shifts. During one such visit, he noticed that the corrugated iron sheeting atop the wall showed small gaps where the sections joined imperfectly. Standing in the latrine's crude doorway, he could see straight through the gaps to the houses beyond the prison perimeter. Electric lights burned warmly in windows. Citizens moved freely along the streets. Normal life, oblivious and serene, existed perhaps 15 yards away, separated only by brick and iron and armed sentries. The proximity of that freedom became a tangible, physically painful ache deep in his chest. A Boer guard walked past the latrine during Churchill's observation. The man didn't look toward him, didn't break his stride, didn't acknowledge the prisoner's presence in any way. In that moment, Churchill realized the latrine area constituted a small psychological blind spot. Guards, it seemed, avoided looking directly at men performing base bodily functions, a sliver of ingrained courtesy that created predictable, exploitable inattention. The evening shift change occurred reliably at 6 o'clock, creating a 10-minute window when departing sentries walked toward the gate and incoming guards walked towards their positions. During that brief transition, the courtyard's rear corner received only minimal observation. Churchill stepped back inside the latrine before his extended presence drew unwanted attention. His heart hammered against his ribs with something that wasn't quite hope, but strongly resembled its rough, unformed foundation. He mentioned the vital observation to Haldane that night, speaking quietly in the relative privacy of their shared corner. Haldane had been studying the wall structure for weeks, using his engineer's eye to note that the brick showed significant weathering cracks where moisture had penetrated the old mortar joints. It was old construction, pre-war, built more for appearance than for security. The height presented the primary obstacle, but the corrugated iron topping, he mused, might provide handholds if a man could only reach it. Brocky joined their whispered, urgent conversation, reporting that he had overheard guards discussing reduced evening patrols due to a commandant's conference scheduled in Johannesburg the following week. Personnel would be stretched thin. Procedures would become rote and routine rather than vigilant. Churchill lay awake that night, listening to the sounds of 67 men breathing, coughing and shifting restlessly on the hard wooden floors. The mental calculation had begun involuntarily, a relentless arithmetic of escape. Wall height 12 feet, his own height barely 6 feet, a crucial gap of 6 feet requiring somehow, somewhere, some method of sudden elevation. The latrine building's roof stood 9 feet high, but it sat a frustrating 15 feet from the wall, far too distant for a running jump. The coal delivery wagons approached within 8 feet of the wall during the morning unloading, but they were constantly surrounded by guards. Every potential solution he devised revealed immediate and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Yet the obstacles felt different now. They were not absolute barriers, but complex problems requiring elegant solutions. They were engineering challenges, not impossibilities. The following evening, Churchill returned to the latrine during the shift change. He timed the guards' movements with the obsessive precision of a man whose very life depended on absolute accuracy. The departing sentry reached the main gate at 6:03. The replacement emerged from the guardhouse at 6:05. 2 minutes of reduced observation, perhaps as many as 3 if the replacement stopped to light a cigarette as the younger guards often did. 2 minutes to scale 12 feet of worn brick, to cross the sharp corrugated iron, and to drop into the complete unknown beyond. 2 minutes to transform from prisoner to fugitive, from captive to free man, from Winston Churchill, the high-value trophy, to Winston Churchill, the escaped correspondent whose story would electrify London and the Empire. The rain began that night, December's fierce summer storms turning the courtyard to thick mud and the building's interior to a damp, spreading misery. Churchill welcomed it. Rain meant guards hunched miserably under shelter. Rain meant reduced visibility, a grey curtain drawn across the courtyard. Rain meant nature itself was conspiring toward possibility. He didn't discuss the specifics of escape with Haldane or Brocky again. Speaking made plans real, and real plans could be discovered. Instead, he watched and waited and calculated. his mind transforming the state model school from an unbreachable prison to an intricate puzzle, its walls not barriers, but merely the final formidable obstacle between captivity and the open veldt beyond, where a man who knew how to move fast and think with razor clarity might yet find his way home. Chapter 3. The Breaking Point, December 10th, 1899. Churchill stood in the moonlit courtyard of the Staats Model School, watching a sentry march his predictable route along the east wall, 62 paces from the latrine corner to the corrugated iron fence. Turn 62 paces back. This pattern repeated nightly between 6:45 and 7:15 p.m. The window when sentries changed positions and the commandant took his meal. Churchill had counted those paces 14 times over the past week. Tonight, he finally understood what they meant. The trigger came 3 hours earlier. A newly captured British officer, bleeding from a Mauser wound to his shoulder, stumbled into the courtyard with devastating news. The Boer forces had surrounded General Buller's relief column at Colenso. The British were pinned down, taking catastrophic casualties. No rescue was coming. The officer overheard Boer commanders discussing the prisoner's fate: transfer to Pretoria's maximum security facility, or worse, the isolated camps near Waterval where prisoners simply disappeared. Churchill's chest tightened as the reality crystallized. The gentlemanly detention of the Staats Model School was temporary. Soon he would be buried in a proper military prison where escape would be impossible, or he would vanish into the veldt, another correspondent who got too close to the war. He had perhaps 2 or 3 weeks before transfer orders arrived. The new prisoner's shoulder was crudely bandaged with a strip of his own shirt. Churchill recognized the shade of arterial blood, bright, urgent, honest. The man would likely survive, but his war was over. Churchill's war, by contrast, was about to begin in earnest. For 23 days, Churchill had endured the Staats Model School with the patience expected of a gentleman correspondent. He followed the rules, attended roll calls, made polite conversation, and ate the meagre rations without complaint. He wrote letters that said nothing while appearing to say everything. He had been the model prisoner, believing British honour demanded it and that freedom would arrive through diplomatic channels. That belief died with the news from Colenso. In the courtyard, Churchill began to see the prison differently. The 15-foot wall, once an immovable barrier, was now a tactical problem to be solved. The guards he had greeted each morning became patterns of behaviour to be exploited. Their rifles, once omnipresent, were absent from certain sight lines at predictable intervals. The prison wasn't a fortress, it was a puzzle, and Churchill had spent 3 weeks inadvertently studying every piece. His mind shifted into the analytical mode from his cavalry years in India and Sudan: asset inventory, excellent physical condition despite minimal rations, 23 days of careful observation providing detailed intelligence on guard routines. £4 sewn into his belt, passable knowledge of Dutch and Afrikaans, intimate familiarity with South African geography, the ability to pass as civilian in his correspondent's clothes. Liabilities: a high-profile prisoner whose escape would trigger a massive manhunt. No weapon, no map beyond his memory, no contacts outside the prison walls, no survival supplies for travel through hostile territory. The potential for an international incident that could destroy his career even if he succeeded. He calculated the odds with military precision. Stay, certain transfer to worse captivity, possible execution if the Boers decided correspondents were more trouble than they were worth, guaranteed irrelevance as the war continued without him. Escape, probable death through recapture and execution. Possible death from exposure or hostile civilians, slim chance of reaching Portuguese East Africa 300 miles distant. The mathematics were brutal, but they pointed in only one direction. Churchill turned his attention to the 62 paces with renewed focus. The sentry was a young Boer, perhaps 19, with the slouched posture of someone who had spent too many uneventful nights walking the same route. He never varied his pace, never looked behind him during the turn, never checked the shadows near the latrine corner where the wall met the corrugated fence at a right angle, creating a blind spot that lasted exactly 45 seconds during each patrol cycle. The wall itself was 15 feet of rough-hewn stone, topped with a wooden coping. No barbed wire. The Boers apparently believed the height and armed sentries provided sufficient deterrence. Churchill had watched other prisoners eye that wall with desperate longing during exercise periods, but none had attempted it. The cost of failure was too obvious: a bullet in the back, or capture followed by transfer to conditions that made the Staats Model School seem like a holiday resort. But Churchill noticed what the others had missed. The stone wall had been constructed with economy rather than precision. The mortar between stones had eroded in places, creating finger holds. A drainpipe ran down the wall's interior face near the latrine corner, rusted, probably unstable, but potentially useful for the first few feet of ascent. And most critically, that 45-second blind spot in the sentry's patrol pattern aligned perfectly with the shadow cast by the main building at this hour. He began watching the other prisoners with equal intensity. Captain Aylmer Haldane and Lieutenant Brocky had been discussing escape for days, their whispered conversations audible during evening mess. Haldane was a professional soldier, methodical and cautious. Brocky was younger, more impulsive, nursing a shoulder wound from his capture. Both men had the skills Churchill lacked: military training in land navigation, weapons proficiency, survival techniques. But Churchill also recognized something darker in their planning. They were waiting for the perfect moment, the ideal conditions, the comprehensive plan that would guarantee success. They were thinking like military officers who had time to prepare a proper operation. Churchill was thinking like a correspondent who understood that the perfect moment never comes. You create it from whatever materials circumstance provides. He caught Haldane's eye across the courtyard. The captain gave an almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the shared awareness that their window was closing. They would talk tonight, after lights out, in whispers beneath the watchful silence of the other prisoners who had already resigned themselves to captivity. Churchill's hands had begun to shake, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of decision finally made. For 3 weeks, his body had endured confinement with controlled patience. Now that patience was transforming into explosive energy that demanded release, his muscles felt coiled, ready. His mind was racing through contingencies and scenarios with a clarity he hadn't experienced since his last cavalry charge. He mapped the prison geography in his mind with surveyor's precision. The Staats Model School sat in the center of Pretoria, surrounded by civilian homes and businesses. Once over the wall, he would be in an urban environment where a man in civilian clothes might pass unnoticed in the darkness. The railway station lay 2 miles northeast. He had heard the trains whistling every evening at 9:30 p.m. Coal trains heading east toward Portuguese territory, moving slowly enough to board if one had the nerve and timing. The moon would be 3/4 full tomorrow night, enough light to navigate by, but not so bright as to eliminate the shadows he needed. The weather had been dry. No rain forecast that might alter guard routines or create noise that would mask his movements. Churchill forced himself to consider the consequences with brutal honesty. If captured during the escape attempt, he would likely be shot. The Boers had been clear about their policy toward prisoners who attempted escape. They stopped being protected correspondents and became enemy combatants. Even if they chose not to execute him immediately, transfer to maximum security would follow, ending any future escape possibility. If he succeeded in getting over the wall but was captured in the countryside, the consequences might be worse. Boer civilians had little patience for British prisoners wandering their territory. Summary execution was not unheard of. At minimum, he would face torture or extended imprisonment in truly hellish conditions. And if he succeeded completely, reaching Portuguese territory and freedom, the international incident would be spectacular. The Boers would claim he had violated his parole as a correspondent. The British government would face diplomatic complications. His career as a correspondent would likely be finished, his credibility destroyed by accusations of having violated gentlemanly conduct. But he would be free, and freedom was worth every risk those consequences represented. Churchill's father had died of syphilis 4 years earlier, his brilliant political career destroyed by illness and scandal. His mother lived in London, her money perpetually tight, her social position dependent on her son's success. Churchill carried the weight of family restoration on his shoulders, the need to reclaim prominence through deeds his father's illness had denied him. Rotting in a Boer prison while the greatest war of his generation unfolded without him was unacceptable. Better to die in the attempt than to survive through passive submission. He watched the sentry complete another circuit, 62 paces, turn 62 paces. The mathematical precision of it was almost beautiful. Humans were creatures of habit, even when those habits created fatal vulnerabilities. Churchill had learned this during his years as a cavalry officer. Men would rather maintain comforting routines than adapt to changing threats. This sentry had walked the same route for weeks, perhaps months, and it had become so automatic that he no longer truly saw what surrounded him. Tomorrow night. The decision crystallized with absolute clarity. Tomorrow night at 7 Moonbars p.m., when the sentry began his patrol, and the commandant sat down to his evening meal. No elaborate planning, no perfect preparation, just the wall, the 45-second blind spot, and whatever courage Churchill could summon when the moment arrived. He turned and walked back towards the barracks, his pace deliberately casual, his expression carefully neutral, but inside, every cell in his body was vibrating with the intensity of commitment finally made. He would escape. The only question was whether he would do it alone or with companions. The planning would begin tonight. The escape would happen tomorrow. And whatever followed would follow. The alternative was unthinkable. Chapter 4. Churchill knew within his first week that the only escape from this humiliation was escape itself. The converted school building in Pretoria had been chosen precisely for its security. High walls, limited exits, guards who could observe the entire compound from elevated positions. But prisons designed by bureaucrats always had weaknesses, and Churchill spent his hours of forced idleness finding them. He watched, he memorized patterns, he noted every guard change, every moment of distraction, every shadow that lingered too long after sunset. The Boers were confident in their walls and contemptuous of their British captives. That contempt would be the crack in their armour. 2 other officers shared his desperation. Captain Aylmer Haldane, a professional soldier who felt the sting of captivity as deeply as Churchill felt the sting of irrelevance, had been planning an escape for weeks before Churchill arrived. Sergeant Major Brocky completed the trio, a practical man who knew how to move quietly and how to read the rhythms of military routine. They approached Churchill during an evening walk in the courtyard, speaking in low voices about weather and rations while their eyes communicated everything else. Churchill understood immediately. The calculation was simple. Trust these men or remain trapped. Haldane had military discipline. Brocky had field experience. Churchill had nothing but audacity and a desperate need to matter again. He nodded once. The conspiracy was born. Their plan formed around a single vulnerability Churchill had identified. The latrine building stood against the prison's east wall, its roof within 6 feet of the wall's top. The 10-foot wall was topped with climbable iron railings. Beyond lay a garden and a poorly lit, irregularly patrolled side street. The route to freedom was vertical and visible, but there was a brief window when guards' attention turned elsewhere during evening roll call. The latrine was temporarily unwatched for 60, perhaps 90 seconds. Enough time for a desperate man to climb a wall in plain sight. The technical challenge was minimal compared to the psychological weight. They would go over at dusk on December 12, 1899, during the confusion of evening muster. No tunnel to dig, no wire to cut, no disguises to craft, just a vertical wall and the certainty that if any guard glanced towards the latrine during those 90 seconds, the climber would be shot. Haldane insisted on detailed coordination. Brocky wanted contingencies. Churchill wanted to move immediately, but even he understood that timing was everything. They agreed. Haldane would go first, establishing the route was viable. Churchill would follow 30 seconds later. Brocky would come last, watching for guard reactions. For 3 weeks, they prepared through observation alone. No tools were needed, no materials hoarded. The preparation was mental, mapping guard positions, calculating distances, rehearsing movements in their minds. But Churchill couldn't resist testing his physical readiness. Each morning, he pressed his palms against his cell wall and pushed, building what remained of his shoulder strength. Each evening walk became a chance to gauge the wall's height, to memorize the brickwork pattern, to imagine the climb. His hands were soft from weeks of confinement, his legs weakened from inactivity. Adrenaline would have to compensate for what his body lacked. The close call came on December 8th. A guard named Milan noticed Churchill standing near the latrine building during afternoon exercise, staring at the wall. Milan approached. "What interests you about that wall, Englishman?" Churchill's heart hammered, but he forced a contemptuous laugh. "I was calculating how many of you it would take to build something properly. British engineers would have made it twice as high." Milan spat and walked away, but his eyes lingered on Churchill that afternoon. For 2 days, the guards watched him more carefully. Haldane wanted to postpone. Churchill refused. "They suspect everyone of plotting. If we wait for them to stop watching, we'll wait until the war ends." The psychological pressure fractured them. Haldane became meticulous, rechecking calculations until Brocky had to stop him from pacing. Brocky withdrew into silence, his face set like stone. Churchill oscillated between manic energy and sudden moments of paralyzing doubt. The nights were worst. Lying on his thin mattress, Churchill confronted the mathematics of death. If he fell or was shot, there would be no medical care, only his body left as a warning. His mother would receive a telegram stating he died a fool, not a hero. The humiliation would outlive him, yet rotting in this prison guaranteed irrelevance, which for Churchill was a form of death anyway. Action, even fatal action, was preferable to stagnation. December 11th arrived. Final preparations were silent nods between the three men during evening rations. They ate slowly, forcing down food their nervous stomachs rejected. Churchill's hands shook until he pressed them flat against the table. Haldane's jaw was clenched tight. Brocky's eyes were distant, already beyond the wall. That night, none of them slept. Churchill lay in darkness, listening to his own breathing. He thought of his mother, his political ambitions, the stories he would write. He thought of the bullet that might tear through his back. He accepted it. By dawn, acceptance had hardened into determination. December 12th, 1899. The day stretched endlessly. Churchill forced himself through the routine. Breakfast, exercise, meaningless conversation with other prisoners. Several men knew something was happening, but asked no questions. Some looked at Churchill with envy, others with pity. One old colonel simply nodded, a gesture of respect for the condemned. As dusk approached, the light changed. The compound filled with long shadows. Guards began their evening routine, moving with practiced efficiency towards the courtyard for roll call. Churchill's mouth went dry. His heart rate accelerated despite his attempts to control it. This was the moment. Evening roll call began at 7:15 p.m. precisely. The prisoners assembled in neat rows while guards counted and recounted. Churchill positioned himself at the row's edge near the latrine building. Haldane stood 3 positions away. Brocky was further back. The sky was deepening from purple to black, the compound lit by lanterns that created pools of light separated by expanding darkness. The head guard, a burly Boer named Van Reenen, began the count. Churchill's legs felt disconnected from his body, his vision sharpened until he could see individual bricks in the latrine wall. Haldane moved first. He stepped backward casually, as if adjusting his position in line. 2 steps, 3, then he turned and walked deliberately toward the latrine building. Churchill's throat closed. This was the test. If guards noticed Haldane's movement, everything ended now. But Van Reenen was focused on his count, frustrated by 2 prisoners who kept shifting position. The other guards watched the main group. Haldane reached the latrine entrance and disappeared inside. 30 seconds passed. Churchill counted them in his mind, each second a small eternity. Then Churchill moved. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't allow his body to betray him with caution. He walked directly toward the latrine building with the confidence of a man who had every right to be there. 20 feet, 15. A guard turned his head. Churchill kept walking. 10 feet. The guard looked away. 5 feet. He was inside the latrine building. The stench hit him immediately. Waste and lime and human misery concentrated in darkness. His eyes adjusted. There was Haldane, frozen against the back wall, staring upward at the roof access. But something was wrong. Haldane's face was ashen. He shook his head once, sharply. "Guard repositioned," Haldane whispered. "He's facing this direction now. If we climb, he'll see the movement against the sky." Churchill's mind raced. They had 90 seconds before roll call ended and guards dispersed to their evening posts. If they retreated now, they might get another chance. Might. Or the heightened vigilance after this near attempt might close the window forever. Churchill looked at Haldane, then at the roof. "I'm going," he said. "Stay if you must." Churchill didn't wait for a response. He pulled himself onto the latrine building's internal support beam, then onto the roof. The corrugated iron was cold under his hands, rough with rust. He crawled toward the wall, every movement feeling exposed. The evening air was cooling rapidly. He could hear voices from the courtyard, roll call continuing, guards barking orders. Then he was at the roof's edge, the prison wall rising before him like a cliff face. 6 feet of empty air separated the roof from the wall's top. Churchill stood slowly, his legs trembling from tension and weakness. This was the moment. Jump or retreat, live or die, remain trapped or risk everything. He could see the iron railing at the wall's top, ornamental and sharp. Beyond it, darkness, freedom or death. Churchill bent his knees, feeling his weakened legs protest. His hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. His vision tunneled until all he could see was the wall's top edge. Somewhere behind him, a guard might be turning. A rifle might be rising. He didn't look back. Churchill jumped. His hands caught the iron railing, metal biting into his soft palms. His body slammed against the wall's brick face, knees scraping. For one terrible second, his grip slipped. Then his fingers locked around the railing, tendons screaming. He pulled upward with strength he didn't know remained in his starved frame, shoulders burning, arms shaking. One knee found purchase on a brick outcropping, then the other. He hauled himself upward, gasping, until he was perched on the wall's top, iron railings pressing into his thighs. Below him in the courtyard, roll call continued. Below him in the latrine, Haldane and Brocky watched, frozen. Before him, the garden lay in shadow. Beyond that, a side street. Beyond that, 300 miles to neutral territory. Churchill swung his legs over the railing and dropped into the darkness on the far side. He landed hard, rolling, tasting dirt and blood in his mouth. He was down. He was beyond the wall. Guards hadn't shouted, no shots fired, not yet. But he was still in Pretoria, still in the heart of Boer territory, still alone, weakened and without resources. Freedom was 300 miles of hostile country away. Churchill pressed himself against the garden wall, breathing hard, listening for alarm bells. Silence, then footsteps. A civilian, walking the side street. Churchill waited until the footsteps faded. Then he stood, every muscle protesting, and began walking away from the prison. Behind him, the guards remained speechless. The British correspondent had climbed their wall in plain sight during evening roll call, and they hadn't seen until he was gone. Chapter 5. The Pursuit. Churchill's boots slammed against frozen earth as he hit the ground beyond the wall and ran. The shock of the landing jolted up his spine, but there was no time for pain. No careful steps now, no measured pace. This was pure primal flight through Pretoria's industrial sprawl, lungs burning in the thin, high-veld air that felt too sharp, too cold to be nourishing. Every breath was a razor drawn across his chest. Behind him, the State Model School's lights blazed against the night sky, a hateful beacon marking the point of his audacity. Ahead, there was only darkness and the sprawling rail yards he'd memorized from brief, desperate glimpses through his prison windows. 200 yards, 300. For now, the walls still blocked any direct view of the compound. There was still time, precious seconds, before they would discover him missing. His right ankle buckled on a patch of uneven, rock-strewn ground. A spike of white-hot pain shot up his leg, but he caught his balance with a lurch and kept moving, propelled forward by sheer terror. The prison clothes, a coarse tweed suit, felt impossibly conspicuous, even in the deep shadows. He imagined them glowing under the moon, a clear target for any Boer patrol that might be lurking. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he could hear nothing else. No shouts of discovery behind him, no clanging alarm bells, just the syncopated roar of blood pounding in his skull and his own ragged, desperate gasping. The oppressive December heat had not broken with nightfall. Sweat soaked his collar, a stark contrast to the evening chill that was beginning to settle over the land. His hands still shook, not from cold, but from the adrenaline of gripping the wall, from that final, irrevocable moment of commitment when he'd hauled himself over the top and there was no retreat possible. The rail yards materialized from the darkness like the skeleton of some immense metal beast. Tracks of steel gleamed faintly under a quarter moon, stretching out like silver ribbons into the vast emptiness. Lines of silent freight cars formed canyons of shadow, all pointing east toward Lourenço Marques and the sanctuary of Portuguese neutrality. 300 miles through hostile Boer territory. 300 miles with no papers, no provisions, no weapon, and no maps beyond the crude geography he'd burned into his memory from stolen glances at newspapers. Churchill dropped into a low crouch beside the nearest freight car, pressing his back against the cold, dew-slicked metal. He forced himself to breathe slower, deeper, listen. Gauge what pursuit might already be forming in the receding city glow. Silence. Only the distant, muted hum of Pretoria. No frantic whistles, no pounding feet, not yet. He moved on, a ghost flitting along the line of cars, his fingers probing at heavy wooden doors. Locked, locked, locked again. The frustration mounted with each failure. The main freight trains, he knew, departed after midnight. He'd painstakingly timed their schedules from the monotonous routine of prison life. Hours yet before this particular line would move. It was far too long to wait, exposed and vulnerable in the open yards. He needed distance, and he needed it now. The next train, any train moving east. A sudden hiss of steam from 3 tracks over drew his attention. Churchill ran low, bent at the waist, darting between the static cars until he reached the active line. He peered around a corner and saw a locomotive, its great black boiler radiating heat into the night. A crew was working near the engine, their voices carrying on the still air. They were loading coal, checking couplings, their silhouettes stark against the firebox's glow. There was no way to board near them without being seen. He reversed course, working backward along the length of the train, moving away from the workers and the light. He tested each car he passed. Grain, more grain. A stock car that reeked of cattle and old manure. Finally, his searching hands found a latch that gave way. He slid the heavy door open a few feet and peered inside. It was a coal car, half filled with large, rough canvas sacks. It was his only chance. He hauled himself up and over the edge, the muscles in his arms screaming in protest. Inside, he wedged his body into the narrow gap between the sacks and the wall, pulling loose lumps of coal over his prison clothes until he was nearly buried. The black dust filled his nose and mouth, acrid and suffocating, but it was better than being seen. The train gave a violent jerk. Couplings clanged and shrieked down the line, the sound echoing through the metal car. Churchill's muscles locked in a spasm of hope and fear. Moving, it was actually moving. The State Model School receded into the constellation of Pretoria's lights as the locomotive gathered speed, chuffing with increasing urgency. He permitted himself one full, deep breath, the air thick with coal grit. He was not free, not even close, but he was mobile. Distance was opening between him and the camp. It was the first, most essential element of survival. Then a whistle blew. It was not the train's whistle, it came from behind them, from Pretoria, the alarm. While Churchill was burying himself in coal dust, Captain Opperman was making his meticulous evening rounds at the State Model School. It was standard procedure, count the prisoners before lights out. The British officers in their section, the colonial troops in theirs. Opperman had performed this monotonous duty for 3 months without a single incident. Most of these captured men had given their parole, their word as gentlemen not to escape. Those who hadn't, like the defiant Churchill, were watched continuously. The fence was sound, the guards were alert. Escape simply did not happen from this facility. He entered the officers' section, his lantern casting long dancing shadows. He scanned the dim room, counting heads. He came up short, a flicker of annoyance, not yet alarm. He counted again, slowly this time. Where is Churchill? His voice was sharp. The British officers looked at each other with an air of carefully practiced, almost theatrical confusion. Captain Haldane, the senior officer among them, spoke first. His tone casual. "Stomach trouble, I'm afraid. He's been in the latrine all evening." "Which latrine?" Opperman snapped. "The far one, I believe, Captain." Opperman strode across the yard to the latrine building, his boots crunching on the gravel. Empty. He checked the other one, closer to the barracks. Also empty. He returned to the officers' section, his face a darkening thundercloud. "Search the compound, now!" Guards scattered, their lanterns bobbing through the buildings, the circular yard, the laundry, the cookhouse. Nothing. Opperman, a cold dread coiling in his gut, walked to the section of fence along the rear wall where the shadows were deepest, where that damned perimeter streetlight never properly illuminated the corner. Where, and his stomach dropped, the corrugated tin sheets used for roof repairs still leaned against the brickwork. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. The tin had been subtly repositioned, not just leaning, but arranged. Arranged to mask someone standing flush against the wall. Arranged to hide someone climbing. "Sound the alarm," he roared, his voice cracking. "Prisoner escaped. Get me General Joubert immediately." The State Model School erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers poured from their barracks. Lanterns blazed to life across the entire compound. Opperman could only stare at the wall, his mind racing through the catastrophic implications. Churchill had been missing for how long? The evening count was at 8. It was now past 9. An hour's head start, maybe more. If he'd slipped away during the evening exercise period and the other officers had covered for him. General Joubert arrived within 20 minutes, his face looking as if it were carved from granite in the flickering lantern light. "Which way?" "Unknown, sir. The wall faces the rail yards." "He's going for the trains," Joubert stated, his voice flat and certain. "Lorenzo Marques is his only hope." He turned to his adjutant, his mind already mobilizing an entire nation's resources. Telegraph every station master between here and the Portuguese border. Description: Churchill, Winston, 25 years old, medium height, reddish hair, last seen in civilian prison clothes. We will assume he is armed and dangerous. It will ensure our men are cautious. Post a £500 reward for his recapture. Alert all commandos in the eastern districts. Get the police in every town involved. I want roadblocks on every single route east. Opperman felt his career crumbling into dust. Sir, the other British officers, lock them down. Double guards. No one else escapes. Joubert cut him off, then turned, his eyes like flint. And Opperman, find him. Churchill embarrassing the Republic in his dispatches from the front was bad enough. Churchill escaping our most secure prison, while war correspondents from every nation are watching from Pretoria. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Within 30 minutes, telegraph wires were humming across the vast expanse of the Transvaal. Station masters from Pretoria to the border town of Komatipoort received the urgent description: police in every district mobilized. Farmers were warned by dispatch riders to watch for a fugitive with reddish hair heading east. The entire Boer military apparatus, which had so effectively stymied the might of the British Empire for months, now focused its considerable efficiency on the recapture of one escaped prisoner of war. Aboard the train, Churchill felt the rhythm change, the clatter of the wheels slowing. His eyes snapped open. He dozed off despite the sheer terror. Raw exhaustion finally overwhelming the rush of adrenaline. The locomotive was braking. Slices of station lights appeared through the thin gaps in the coal car's wooden walls. He pressed himself flatter against the rough sacks, willing himself to become part of the coal, and stopped breathing. The train jerked to a final shuddering halt. Voices echoed outside. Afrikaans, multiple speakers. Their tones clipped and authoritative. Boots crunched on the platform gravel, coming closer. His car was only 8 cars back from the locomotive, far too close to the front, where any inspection would certainly start. Churchill's fingers dug into the coarse fabric of the coal sacks. If they searched the cars, if they decided to slide open this door, Churchill escaped from Pretoria. All eastbound trains are being checked. The voice was terrifyingly clear, close, and urgent. Ice flooded Churchill's veins. They knew, already they knew. The alarm had gone out far faster than he had ever anticipated. The Boers were brutally efficient. He had gambled on confusion, on bureaucratic delay. Instead, they had mobilized the entire region within the hour. Footsteps approached his car. He could see nothing through the darkness and the stifling coal dust, could only hear the heavy boots coming closer, then stopping. A hand fumbled with the door. The latch rattled loudly, the sound like a gunshot in the silence of his car. Churchill coiled every muscle, his mind flashing between fighting, fleeing, or surrendering. "This one's empty according to the manifest," a different voice called out. "Just coal sacks. Check the passenger cars further back." The footsteps moved on. Churchill remained frozen for 10 minutes after the train lurched back into motion. His whole body shook with a violent tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the aftershock of his knife-edge proximity to capture. It was the dawning, terrifying understanding of how thorough this pursuit would be. They were checking trains already. While he was still on one, he couldn't stay in this car. He couldn't ride all the way to Lourenço Marques, hiding in coal sacks, while systematic inspections happened at every single station. The Boers would find him eventually through sheer procedural thoroughness. He needed a different strategy, and he needed it before the next stop. The train built speed again, leaving the station lights behind and plunging into the vast open country. Churchill crawled over the sacks to the door, easing it open just a crack. A blast of cold wind hit his face, carrying the scent of dry grass. The Highveld stretched endlessly under the indifferent starlight, a rolling sea of grassland and dark, looming kopjes. There were no towns visible, no friendly lights, only the pinpricks of distant, unknown farmsteads. He gauged the train's speed. It was too fast to jump safely. But he knew that slowing for the next station meant another inspection, another roll of the dice with even worse odds. Better to risk broken bones in the dark than the certainty of a rope or a firing squad. Churchill waited, scanning the terrain until it looked marginally less hostile, a stretch of flat scrubland instead of jagged rocks. He pushed the door wider, crouched in the opening, and watched the dark ground blur past. Every instinct, every fiber of his being screamed against jumping into that rushing blackness. The rational part of his brain frantically calculated speeds and impact angles. Neither instinct nor reason offered him good odds. The train's whistle blew for a crossing, its mournful sound echoing across the veld. The speed dropped slightly. It was now or never. Churchill jumped. He hit the ground at what felt like 100 miles per hour, tucking and rolling exactly wrong. He slammed into the hard-packed earth, which felt like solid iron. His shoulder took the primary impact, and pain exploded through his collarbone like a starburst. The world spun violently. Sky and ground traded places in a nauseating, chaotic blur. He tumbled end over end through scrub grass and thorns that tore at his clothes and skin, finally coming to a stop face down in the dirt. The air knocked from his lungs. He lay there, unable to breathe, unable to move, as the train's rumble faded into the enormous, profound silence of the empty veld. Minutes passed before he could draw a shallow, ragged breath. More minutes passed before he could summon the will to move his arms. He tested them gingerly. Left arm functional. Right shoulder screamed in agony but was miraculously mobile. His ribs were intact. His legs worked. He had survived, barely. With a deep groan, Churchill forced himself upright. The train had vanished completely into the darkness. Behind him, perhaps 30 miles back across the black expanse, lay Pretoria and the heart of the pursuit. Ahead, 270 miles of enemy territory stood between him and Portuguese neutrality. He had no food, no water, no map. His prison clothes still marked him as a fugitive. His right arm was a throbbing, nearly useless weight. The night was deepening toward an absolute star-dusted darkness. He started walking east. He walked because stopping meant dying. He walked because being captured meant a likely execution as an escaped prisoner during wartime. He walked because somewhere far ahead was freedom, and all that lay behind him was the tightening noose of the hunt. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. His boots scraped and crunched on the rocky ground, each step sending a jolt of pain through his damaged shoulder. He navigated by the Southern Cross, keeping it to his left, maintaining a rough eastward bearing. The veld offered no shelter, no comfort, just endless grass, sharp rocks, and the occasional skeletal thorn tree. No water sources were visible. His mouth already tasted of coal dust and a desperate burgeoning thirst. Behind him, far to the west, new lights moved across the darkness. Not a town, searchers, the glint of lanterns on horseback. The pursuit was spreading outward from Pretoria in ever-widening circles, sweeping the land for him. Churchill kept walking. The lights grew brighter, closer. Chapter 6. Churchill's mind catalogued every detail of the prison routine. The state's model school in Pretoria held 60 British officers, but the guards had grown complacent. With their revolution won, the Boers treated guard duty as a tedious necessity, not a vigilant watch. Churchill noticed a crucial pattern. Between 7 and 8 each evening, the sentries congregated near the main gate during dinner. In the northeast corner, the latrine stood separated from the perimeter wall by a 15-foot stretch of empty ground. That wall, 10 feet of brick topped with iron railings, ran along an unlit side street. No searchlights, no patrols. The guards trusted the wall and the assumption that no officer would attempt escape in plain sight during the busiest hour of the prison day. December the 12th, 1899. Churchill ate nothing at dinner. His stomach knotted too tight for food. Captain Aylmer Haldane and Lieutenant Brocky knew his intention. They planned to follow once he cleared the way. The plan was simple to the point of insanity. Walk to the latrine, wait for the opportune moment, climb the wall, drop into the street, and vanish. He had no disguise, no forged papers, no accomplices waiting. Just the wall and the gamble that audacity would trump caution. At 7:15, Churchill rose from the table and walked toward the latrine, hands in his pockets, pace unhurried. Officers moved freely within the compound during evening hours. Nothing seemed unusual about a man heading to relieve himself. He reached to the latrine and paused in its shadow. The wall loomed ahead, its brick grey in the fading light, iron railings spiking the top like broken teeth. Beyond it lay Pretoria, 40,000 Boers and 300 miles of hostile territory to Portuguese East Africa. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced his breathing steady. This moment would define everything. Success meant freedom and restoring his narrative. Failure meant solitary confinement, possibly execution. The Boers had shot other escapees and would not hesitate if provoked. He watched the guards. 2 sentries were visible near the gate, 60 yards distant, facing inward toward the main buildings. Their rifles were slung casually over their shoulders. They were talking to each other, not looking his way. Churchill stepped from the latrine's shadow and walked directly toward the wall. 15 feet of open ground, completely exposed. Any guard glancing this way would see him instantly. He walked neither fast nor slow, but purposefully, like a man with legitimate business. 10 feet from the wall, still no shout. 5 feet. The brick surface showed handholds where mortar had eroded. His hands found purchase. He climbed, not scrambling, but a smooth upward movement that might pass for routine maintenance if glimpsed peripherally. The iron railings reached his chest. He gripped the bars and pulled himself higher. His boots found the top of the brick. He stood balanced on the wall's narrow cap, railings now at waist height. The street below was dark and empty, 10 feet down to cobblestones. Behind him the compound was visible, guards still facing away. No alarm raised. They hadn't seen him. Impossible but true. He was standing atop the prison wall in full view of 60 prisoners and a dozen guards, and nobody had noticed. Churchill gripped the railings and swung his legs over. The iron bars bit into his palms. He hung suspended for 1 frozen second, body dangling on the outside of the prison wall, boots scrabbling for holds that didn't exist. This was it. Release the railings and drop. Trust the darkness and his ankles. Trust that no guard would turn to see a man-shaped shadow falling from the wall. He let go. Gravity took him. The drop lasted forever, and no time at all. His boots struck cobblestones hard, the impact shooting up his legs. He stumbled forward, barely kept his feet, and pressed himself flat against the outside of the wall, breathing raggedly. He waited for the shout, the alarm bell, the crack of rifle fire. Nothing. Only distant voices from inside the compound. He had cleared the wall. He stood free on a Pretoria street. The audacity had worked. Churchill forced his legs to move, walking along the wall's shadow away from the main gate. Every window might hold watching eyes. Every doorway might shelter a vigilant Boer. His civilian clothes, a brown suit, offered thin camouflage. The street opened into a broader avenue where gas lamps burned at intervals. He had no map, no clear destination. East. He had to go east, toward the railroad line to Lourenço Marques, 300 miles through enemy country. He had no food, no water, no weapon, no compass. The prison conducted roll call at 9 each evening. He had perhaps 90 minutes before they knew he was gone. Then the manhunt would begin. Telegrams, descriptions, patrols. 90 minutes to put distance between himself and this place. He walked through Pretoria's streets, his heart hammering. Every Boer he passed might recognize him. His face had been in newspapers, his capture publicized. Any citizen might raise the alarm. He kept his pace steady, his expression neutral, like a man walking home. The streets thinned as he moved east, giving way to industrial sprawl, warehouses and rail yards. He needed the railroad. Trains ran east carrying supplies. Boarding one undetected would cut days from his escape, but the rail yards would be guarded with workers everywhere. The risk was too high. Better to walk, using the rail line for navigation while staying parallel to it in the darkness of the veld. Churchill found the tracks near midnight, twin ribbons of steel gleaming under starlight, running straight towards the eastern horizon. He crouched in tall grass 50 yards from the railbed. A water tower stood nearby. Warehouses flanked the tracks, and lights burned in several buildings. Voices carried on the night air, workers loading freight cars, guards patrolling. Impossible to approach without exposure. He turned from the rail yard and began walking parallel to the tracks, staying in the darkness beyond the lights. The veld opened before him, endless grassland rolling under the stars. The cold air of the high altitude bit through his suit jacket. He had no coat, no blanket, just his body and his will to keep moving. The walking consumed him. 1 foot forward, then the other. The grass whispered against his legs. His boots, made for London streets, rubbed blisters within an hour. The railroad tracks remained visible to his left, a navigation reference. He passed lit and occupied stations where guards watched the rails, knowing they were an escape route. Churchill gave each station a wide berth, circling through the veld before rejoining his parallel path. By 3 in the morning, his body was failing. Blisters had opened on his heels. His legs trembled with exhaustion. He'd walked maybe 15 miles, 285 to go. The math was crushing. At this pace, it would take 20 days. He would be caught within hours of daylight. The Boers would track him with dogs and horsemen. He needed to hide, to rest, to find food and water. But the open veld offered no shelter, and dawn was coming. He saw the mineworks as grey light bled across the eastern horizon. Headframes rose against the sky like skeletal fingers, surrounded by tailings piles. It was a coal mine, still operating despite the war. Workers would arrive at dawn. Yet the compound might offer hiding places. It was a desperate gamble. If discovered, he'd be turned over instantly. Every white man in the Transvaal supported the Boers or remained silent. But he couldn't walk through daylight on the open veld, where he would be visible for miles. The mineworks were his only option. He approached the compound as dawn light strengthened. The buildings were silent. He moved between structures, searching for concealment. A large shed near the coal loading area offered possibility, its door slightly ajar. Churchill slipped inside, pulling the door closed. Darkness and the smell of coal dust enveloped him. His hands explored the space. Wooden walls, a dirt floor, stacks of timber pit props. He crawled behind the timber stacks and wedged himself into the narrow gap between wood and wall. The space barely accommodated his body. Unable to sit upright or extend his legs, he pressed himself into the shadows and waited for the day to pass. Voices woke him near midday. Workers entered the shed, talking in Afrikaans, their boots scuffing the dirt inches from his hiding place as they selected timber props. Churchill held absolutely still, barely breathing, certain of discovery. His body screamed from the cramped position, his throat on fire with thirst. The workers returned twice more that afternoon. Each time, Churchill pressed himself smaller into his gap, praying the shadows held. The day dragged into an eternity. Heat built inside the shed, soaking his clothes in sweat. Thirst became agony. His tongue swelled in his mouth. He hadn't had a drink since yesterday's prison dinner. As darkness finally fell and the workers departed, Churchill crawled from his hiding place. His legs buckled and he collapsed, muscles locked. He forced himself upright. Water. He needed water, or he would die here. A water barrel stood outside the shed. He drank in desperate gulps, not caring if anyone saw. The water tasted of rust and coal dust, but it was salvation. He drank until his stomach protested, then drank more. His body began functioning again, clear thought returned. He couldn't stay. The Boers would have telegraphed every settlement with his description. Reward money would be offered. He needed to move. to find a hiding place the searchers wouldn't think to check. The mineworks also had rail cars loaded with coal, waiting for the morning train east. If he could hide inside one, he could cover distance without walking. The risk was enormous, but staying meant certain capture. He moved toward the freight cars waiting on the siding. The coal cars stood in a line partially filled. Churchill studied the nearest one. It was open-topped and about 1/3 full, enough to hide beneath, but workers might add more coal, burying him alive. The next car was the same. The third car was fuller, coal heaped nearly to the top, unlikely to receive more loading. He climbed the ladder and looked down. He could lie flat in a depression, cover himself with loose coal, and pray the train departed before workers arrived. It was insanity, but every option was. Churchill lowered himself into the car and began arranging his hiding place. The coal was sharp and unforgiving. He scraped out a shallow trench, lay down, and pulled chunks of coal over himself. The dust filled his nose and mouth. He choked back coughs. More coal covered his legs, torso, and arms. He left his face partially exposed to breathe, then sprinkled coal dust over it for camouflage. He lay buried in a freight car, in the heart of enemy territory, invisible, suffocating, and utterly committed. If the train moved east, he would survive. If discovered, it ended here. He had committed his life to this gamble. Churchill lay in his coal grave and waited. The train jerked into motion near 8 in the morning. Couplings clanged and the coal shifted, pressing hard against his chest. He could barely breathe. As the train picked up speed, he knew he was moving east. Success or death, he was moving. The journey lasted hours. Coal dust caked his throat. His body ached. As the sun climbed, the coal became an oven, and sweat turned the dust to a black paste on his skin. He endured. Finally, the train slowed, brakes squealing. A station. The train stopped. Voices called out in Afrikaans. He lay frozen, listening to boots on gravel. Nobody approached his car. After 20 minutes, the whistle blew and motion resumed. Eastward. He had passed one station. The second stop came as afternoon light began to fade. The train halted longer this time, with more activity. Churchill calculated he was perhaps 70 miles from Pretoria. Still over 200 to go, deep in Boer territory and hunted. The coal car would eventually be unloaded. He couldn't ride all the way. He needed to emerge while darkness offered concealment, and he was still ahead of the search. The voices faded. The train remained stationary. Now. Churchill pushed upward, coal cascading from his body. He rose from his grave, black as a demon, his eyes showing white in a face of pure coal dust. He climbed from the car and dropped to the ground. The station lay 100 yards behind him. Ahead, the veld stretched dark and open. He stumbled away from the rails into the grass. The train sat silent. Nobody pursued. Churchill collapsed, his body shaking with exhaustion and relief. He had covered 70 miles in 3 days. 230 remained. But he was alive, he was free, and he was moving towards salvation. Chapter 7. Winston Churchill returned to England a hero in July 1900, but the story he carried would take decades to fully surface. The young war correspondent's escape from the Staats Model School in Pretoria had made headlines, yet the complete truth, the calculated risks, moral compromises, and men left behind remained locked in private letters and classified reports for over half a century. His triumphant return masked a complicated legacy, one that would be forgotten, rediscovered, and ultimately reshape how modern militaries understand the ethics of captivity and escape. Churchill's first weeks of freedom were a whirlwind of recognition. Upon reaching Durban in January 1900, he was an instant celebrity. His escape having received breathless coverage in the British press. He cabled his mother, "I have escaped, I am free." But military debriefers wanted more than headlines. British intelligence officers questioned him for 3 days about Pretoria's defences, guard rotations, and Boer troop movements. His photographic memory proved invaluable. A detailed sketch of the Pretoria to Lourenço Marques Railway, including vulnerable points, was circulated to commanders, and his intelligence on Boer morale and supplies influenced General Roberts's strategy for the final push to Pretoria. Yet even in triumph, Churchill understood the cost. Haldane and Brocky remained imprisoned. Humiliated by his disappearance, the Boer authorities tightened security at the Staats Model School to punishing levels, with increased patrols and reduced privileges. Churchill's celebrity had worsened their situation. He wrote to his mother, "I am distressed about those I left behind." When Pretoria fell to British forces in June 1900, Haldane and Brocky were liberated. Their reunion with Churchill was polite but strained. Haldane would later write that the solo escape was a betrayal of our partnership, though he admitted Churchill never explicitly promised to wait. The wound between them never healed. Brocky's private letters reveal a man who felt abandoned at the critical moment. Churchill's return to active service was swift. He secured a commission as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse while continuing to write dispatches for the Morning Post for a large salary. He participated in the relief of Ladysmith and entered Pretoria with the conquering British Army, experiencing a strange and intense satisfaction at the gates of his former prison. His 1900 book, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, portrayed his escape as a daring individual achievement, minimizing the roles of Haldane and Brocky. The bestseller launched his political career, and he won election to the House of Commons in October 1900 at age 25. The story faded quickly. As the Boer War ended in 1902, Churchill's political career accelerated through high-profile cabinet posts, and his escape became a footnote. By World War I, it was remembered, if at all, as an adventure story. The moral complexities, abandoned partners, civilian risk, and intelligence value were lost in a simplified narrative of British pluck. This forgetting was systematic. British military culture didn't dwell on captivity. Capture represented a failure best moved past. Churchill's escape was celebrated precisely because it erased his captive status. Questions about a non-combatant's duty, the endangerment of other prisoners, and obligations to those left behind went unasked in public. The strategic value of his information remained classified. Officially, he was just a brave young man. Haldane's 1948 memoir, A Soldier's Saga, began the rediscovery. Published when Churchill was a towering World War II hero, the book offered a corrective. Haldane detailed the three-man plan, Churchill's impatience, and the harsh aftermath for the remaining prisoners. Without attacking the revered leader directly, the facts spoke clearly. "We had planned together," Haldane wrote, "but in the end, each man made his own choice. Churchill chose fame. I chose loyalty to our partnership." Amid post-war rebuilding, the book received polite reviews but little attention. Haldane died in 1950, his version of events a footnote. The real shift came in 1972 with historian Thomas Pakenham's The Boer War, which drew on newly opened archives. Pakenham accessed classified files, including Churchill's 1900 debriefing. For the first time, the public learned that Churchill's intelligence had directly contributed to targeting decisions that hastened Pretoria's fall. Pakenham also located unpublished letters between Churchill and Haldane from 1901. Churchill defended his choice. "Opportunities in war are fleeting. I seized mine." Haldane's firm response argued that an officer's duty is to his men and his word, not to opportunity. Pakenham's research also uncovered the fate of John Howard, the British mine manager who hid Churchill. Arrested by Boer authorities, Howard was imprisoned and his business confiscated. The British government quietly compensated him after the war, but his sacrifice was buried to protect the hero narrative. The 1980s brought rediscovery through the lens of military ethics. The US military's seer, Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, schools seized on Churchill's escape not for the adventure, but for its ethical questions. Instructors developed a case study still taught today, forcing students to grapple with competing obligations, duty to partners versus duty to return to service, individual survival versus group cohesion. Churchill's choice is presented as consequential, not simply right or wrong. This exact dilemma influenced the 1988 update to the military's Code of Conduct. According to declassified memos, Churchill's case was cited during the drafting of Article 3. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. The clause acknowledges both imperatives, the value of an individual escaping and the personal cost of perceived betrayal. Modern military historians and instructors continue to treat the escape as a primary case study in the moral ambiguity of captivity. A 2003 Naval War College analysis argued that expecting clear moral choices in such situations imposes peacetime standards on wartime chaos. As one SEER instructor explained, the historical distance allows students to analyze the hard questions dispassionately. What did he owe Haldane, other prisoners, and the British cause? The point he noted is that in captivity, there's no simple answer. You make the best choice you can and live with the consequences. This multifaceted legacy is now reflected in several museums. The Winston Churchill Memorial and Library in Fulton, Missouri, presents the escape not as a simple heroic tale, but a complicated decision with mixed outcomes, including Churchill's later privately expressed regrets. The Intelligence Museum at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, focuses on the strategic outcome, highlighting his debriefing as a key example of how an escapee's intelligence can aid operational planning, a principle now central to military doctrine. Conversely, the Ditsong National Museum of Military History in Johannesburg presents The Escape as a Lesson in Prison Security, detailing how the Boers humiliated, implemented reforms that made subsequent escapes harder. Together, these exhibits show a story with personal, strategic, and adversarial consequences. The story endures because it captured something essential about Churchill's character: the willingness to make difficult decisions quickly, accept personal risk, and live with the consequences, including moral ambiguity. His biographers see the Pretoria escape as the formative experience that shaped his command style. When he later made controversial decisions as First Lord of the Admiralty or Prime Minister, decisions that saved some while costing others, he demonstrated the same calculus he employed in 1899. Assess the opportunity, accept the cost, act decisively, and carry the burden. The wall Churchill climbed is long gone, the school demolished in the 1960s. A small plaque in Pretoria marks the spot. Each year, on December 12th, a handful of historians and enthusiasts gather there. They read from his account, note Haldane's perspective, and acknowledge Howard's sacrifice. The ceremony is quiet but persistent. In 2019, on the 120th anniversary, Haldane's great-grandson and Churchill's great-grandson met at the plaque and shook hands, their family's first communication since the 1950s. The London Times headline read, "Descendants reconcile century-old escape dispute." Both men, the caption noted, served in the military and understood the impossible choices of captivity. Reconciliation, even delayed by 4 generations, had meaning.